Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Club Eisenhower. I'm your host, Todd Arrington, Director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum in Abilene, Kansas. April 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of Allied forces liberating Nazi concentration camps. The Supreme Allied commander in Europe was, of course, General and later President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The horrific things Ike and his troops saw in the concentration camps horrified them and stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Today, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Jason Lantzer to the podcast. He's a historian and the author of Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust, A History. This excellent piece of scholarship explores what Eisenhower and Allied troops saw and experienced when they entered concentration camps as liberators. The book also shows us how this experience changed Dwight D. Eisenhower and affected the rest of his military career and later his 8 years as the 34th President of the United States. Dr. Jason Lantzer, welcome to Club Eisenhower. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Todd.
Yeah, great to have you. Thanks for being on. Jason, if you don't mind, I'll start by just asking you, tell us a little bit about yourself and what's your primary interest in terms of scholarship. How did you get interested in writing this book about the topic of Eisenhower's experience with the Holocaust?
Yeah, so I'm a native Hoosier, so I'm a Midwesterner through and through. And I went off to college as the first for my family, so first gen, to the Indiana University. And history was always my favorite topic, so I knew I was going to major in that. I picked up political science as well. About midway through my undergraduate career, I realized I did not want to become a lawyer, which is what everybody always told me I should do. And looking back on that, I wonder if it's just because I like to talk a lot. And they were like, well, I guess he should just talk. But I also had some wonderful undergraduate professors. And in class one day, one of them just took about 5 or 10 minutes to talk about why history was the perfect discipline. And it was a light bulb moment for me. I walked out of that class that day knowing that I did not want to go to law school, that I wanted to do history full time. Went on and got my master's at now Indiana University, Indianapolis. Came back down to Bloomington to do my doctoral dissertation. And again, had some wonderful professors, including some that I didn't have as undergrads, because now I'm in grad school taking different classes and everything. And part of my graduate school experience in the late 90s, early 2000s was that we needed to be prepared to teach anything. And I thought that's great because I love everything when it comes to history, especially American history. And so I've been very fortunate since arriving at Butler University, where I am now here in Indianapolis, to be able to teach on the things that I want to teach about, to do research that's sort of not guardrailed, and to really get to explore that love of history in all its many facets. So, I've done work on Prohibition. I've done work on American religious history. I've done work on Disney, and I've done work on Eisenhower. Someone asked once what the common theme was, and the common theme is that, like me, these are all Midwestern topics, whether you realize it at first or not. And so when it comes to this particular book and this particular project, it has to do with a family here in Indianapolis that donated money to create an undergraduate research opportunity for Butler students to investigate the Holocaust. And it was done because the gentleman who gave the money, both of his parents were Holocaust survivors. And in the second year of the program, one of my former students applied for the opportunity. It's a no holds barred. You define what your research is going to be on. and he asked me to be his advisor for this project, and so I agreed. And he was doing a project on Schindler's List, the impact of the movie, and sort of he wanted to do, did they get it right historically? Sort of a Hollywood versus history kind of thing. He discovered that there were materials at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that was germane to what he wanted to do, but he had enough money to go to Poland, but not to Washington, D.C. And so I happened to be going out to D.C. on an unrelated mission, and I said, well, I can swing by, and I've never been to the museum. I'd love to get into the archives and see what that's like. And I did. I got what he needed, and then I took the tour. And if you have ever been, or if you have not been, to the permanent exhibit at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, you ride the elevator up to the top, and then you work your way down. But when those elevator doors open, you are confronted with what I described as the quote. It's an excerpt from a letter that Eisenhower sent to General George Marshall describing seeing the Ohrdorf camp. And there are some pictures with that. And that to me, it stuck with me the rest of my time at the museum. I read the quote. I suddenly, it sort of clicked as to why we have this museum in Washington, D.C., why it was important. And also, it bothered me. It bothered me because I knew that I had read that quote or portions of that quote, whether it was in a World War II books or biographies of Eisenhower. But it bothered me because I didn't think anybody had ever done anything with it. And how was that possible, given who this guy was and who he became as president? And so for my entire time down, I was thinking about the quote. I went straight into the bookstore and started pulling books off of the shelf and flipping to the index to see, did they mention the quote? Is Eisenhower listed at all in the books? When I got home from D.C., I did the same thing with the books on my bookshelf. And I quickly discovered that most authors who mention it quote the quote, and that was it. And to me, that could not have been the full story. And so it became sort of a little side passion project that just mushroomed into eventually the book that is now out and about.
And this is the same quote that I think is also on the outside of the building as well. Is this the same quote? Okay.
Yeah.
I just picked up your book here, and I if it's okay, I'll read the quote.
Sure.
Which of course comes from Eisenhower. This is a note he wrote on April 15th, 1945, 80 years ago today, from the day that we're recording this podcast, in fact. And this was Eisenhower writing about his trip to the Ohrdorf concentration camp. And of course, we'll go into this more in just a moment. The things, and this is Eisenhower to Marshall, the things I saw beggar description. While I was touring the camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates and by one ruse or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room where they were piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propagate them. So that's the quote you're talking about. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very powerful. Okay, so since we're talking about this already, let's just kind of jump in. So American forces liberated the Ohrdorf concentration camp on April 4th, 1945. It was the first camp to be liberated by American forces, I think. How much information about what those forces, what those American troops found there made it up the line to General Eisenhower, because of course it's about a week later before he actually goes to the camp. So how much had he heard, if you know, between April 4th when the camp is liberated and April 12th when he actually visits the camp?
The answer is not much. This is one of those things where I think scholars, and I mean, we had the benefit of hindsight. We, of course, would jump at this and be like, how is this not the top thing on the list of all the things that appear on Eisenhower's desk on, say, the morning of April 5th, the day after? And the fact of the matter is that with the Holocaust broadly, with the camps, and with Ohrdruf in general, there's just there are pieces that are appearing in intelligence reports and briefings, but nobody's looking for the connections between those pieces. And so Americans knew that there were camps, that we knew that the Nazis had created a camp system. We did not know, by and large, with what I would say definitive accuracy, what was going on in those camps. Now, should we have? Yes, but there are all sorts of filters in place. So, for example, when information is brought from Europe, from whether it's people who make it out, some of whom have done their own intelligence gathering within concentration camps and ghettos, or it's from the governments in exile, putting forward what's happening in their countries, right? We're getting intelligence as early as 41, 42, London, or the United Kingdom even before then, about what this camp system is. And that's beyond what we knew before the war started, which, for example, I think it was Dachau. When Dachau was open, the Nazis got their tours. They talk about this camp system. It's in the newspapers.
Wow.
And so there is this sort of general knowledge of the camps, but once the war has started and information begins to come in, I think there are a couple of filters in place. One is, yes, there is anti-Semitism, especially when talking about Jewish persecution. There are people within, especially the halls of power in Washington, D.C., who they don't care. There is also a filter in place in terms of a fear, and this is something that Americans have in particular, both in government and in the armed forces, a fear of, is this propaganda? And that fear stems from the First World War, in which the British had inundated American newspapers with propaganda about what the Germans were doing in Belgium in particular and in parts of France. And then after the war, it turns out almost none of those horror stories were true. And so there's this very real skepticism. And you couple that with a skepticism of, especially early on, that this isn't our fight, this isn't our war. And so you've already got things in place that are making it difficult to get information from, say, Washington to Eisenhower in Europe. The other thing that I think is important to remember is that this is not, well, there are two things, I guess. One is this is never a priority. The camps are never prioritized. When pressed, President Franklin Roosevelt will talk, and it becomes the sort of official government talking point, that the best way to end whatever is happening in the camps is to win the war. If you win the war, you end whatever the camps are. It is a perfectly logical argument. It is also wonderfully circular in reasoning. We can't do it. If we divert to do something about the camps, that's not ending the war. Ending the war will end the camps. On and on and on. The other thing is, because it's not a priority, it becomes one of the other things that gets mentioned in briefings, that gets brought, put on Eisenhower's desk. And it's one thing out of many. And if you're thinking as the Supreme Allied Commander, let's say, once and we can get into this topic as well. I mean, what can the United States do in 1942? The answer is not very much. Until we have boots on the ground in Europe proper, and really deep into France or into Germany itself, there's really nothing we can do, even if we want to act on this information. So you're looking at a time span where we know today everything that's going on. We expect, why wasn't something done? And the answer is because we're not in a place to do it, either sort of from an intelligence standpoint or from a actual physically in place able to do anything about it. And the last thing I would say about the camps, at least for now, is that, and knowledge about them, is that Americans don't have a frame of reference for what we discover. Like I said before, we know that the camps are there. The reports, even when they aren't officially acted upon by the government, they're making it into newspaper accounts. The accounts that get into the camps, the claims, the charges, are rarely front page news in American newspapers once the war begins. It's something that happens below the fold and on page 15 or something like that.
Sure.
And this is one of those things when you read the oral histories of American GIs and they get asked, what did you know? And time again, their answer says, well, you talk about a camp, you're thinking, I'm thinking of a church camp or a YMCA camp or maybe a civilian conservation corps camp. I'm not thinking this is someplace where people are being worked, starved, beaten, or just outright murdered. And so even when you've got people who are somewhat knowledgeable about the camp system, they're not thinking about it as this important thing that needs to be done that is, in fact, maybe the crime of the 20th century or of modern history.
So we've said the name Ohrdruf a couple of times now. I think a lot of listeners probably know the names of some of the more famous or really infamous, I guess I should say, concentration camps like Auschwitz and Dachau you mentioned. Ohrdruf is not as well known, even though this is the camp that Eisenhower went to. So just for context purposes, where was Ohrdruf located? What kind of camp was it? Who did the Nazis imprison at Ohrdruf?
So Ohrdruf is a subcamp of Buchenwald. I think it's important to think of the camp system as just that, a system, a network of camps. And so you will have a large camp, we'll pick on Buchenwald, in which there are many subcamps that are attached to it sort of logistically and hierarchically, but are their own separate camps, sometimes separated by hundreds of miles from the main camp, but it's sort of an administrative network.
Wow, I didn't realize. I knew there were subcamps in some cases. I didn't realize they could be that far apart.
There are very few what we would classify as main camps. Most of the camps that are liberated during that last month of the war are really subcamps of some other camp. Now, again, structurally, they've got their own commandant, they've got their own sort of mission statement, but they are linked administratively up the line to other larger camps.
Gotcha.
Ohrdruf is located near the town of Gotha. That's in Hungary. So it's in East Central Germany. I say East Central because it will be in East Germany for most of the second half of the 20th century. But if you look at a map today, it's pretty central to the country. It's in the line of advance. The reason we are moving in towards Gotha is that we have intelligence that there is some sort of underground headquarters being built or is in place. And in fact, that's what most of the people who are at Ohrdruf were doing. They were constructing this underground network of, it was supposed to be for the German high command, sort of a place to get out of Berlin and still be headquartered. It's never finished. But there are workers there. In terms of who is there, it is a hodgepodge of people. There are a lot of Poles. There are some Jews. It's not. There are a lot of Poles, but it's a smattering of people that the Nazis have pulled from other camps. And by this time, by April of 45, you have something else happening as well, which is, well, two things. One is that as the Western and Eastern fronts are collapsing on the Nazis, they are pulling prisoners out of the camps and moving them into camps where they still have control of the territory around them. It's one of those very strange things when you stop and think about it, that the Nazis are really fighting two wars. One is against the Allies. That's the military war, but the other is against their perceived enemies. And these are the people who are ending up in these camps. And
so, like internal enemies, you mean?
Internal enemies, yes, exactly.
Okay. Sure.
And that despite the fact that they're losing the one war, they are continuing to fight the other. And they don't want to give up their labor force. They don't want prisoners being released. Part of it has to do with self-preservation, both in terms of trying to preserve the Reich for as long as possible, but also preservation in, if these people are found alive, they're going to tell the Allies what we did, and we could be in trouble because we're losing the war at this point if you're the Germans. And so, and there's this other belief, and it's not unjustified, that they need these workers. What is keeping the German economy moving is this forced labor system by this time. The Germans never embrace, despite talking about it several times, the concept of total war. Women are, until almost the very end, discouraged or kept out of war industries. The Nazis were very sort of, no, men need to be in the factories, women need to be at home. The problem with that is if you're pulling all of the German men to go into the military, but you still need those factories to run. And so the answer was, we'll bring in foreign workers, forced labor, of course, or we'll use prisoners. And so they have to keep those prisoners alive. So Ohrdruf it has swelled in population in March very briefly because they're bringing prisoners in. It's seen as still a secure area. As the American forces are advancing through Thungaria, though, they begin to march. This happens just a few days ahead of when the American units actually arrive in Ohrdruf. They begin to move the healthiest workers out and put them on and for some, their second or maybe third death march to Dachau. To try and get them again to a camp that is still under German control. So there are people who are still in the camp when American forces arrive, but they are either quite sick or deemed unable to make that trek. And so the Nazis figure they'll probably die within a couple of days. So just leave them there.
What was the distance between Ohrdruf and Dachau? How long was that death march for people that were forced to go on that?
It's a hike. I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah.
It's not. This is another area where this doesn't happen in this particular case necessarily, but it does happen in some of the camps in which the Nazis are willing to utilize their existing railroad capacity to move prisoners as opposed to moving war material or German refugees who are fleeing or moving even military units. When we talk about this notion of the Nazis fighting two wars, in some respects, what we would broadly classify as the camp system, the Holocaust, takes precedent over actually fighting and winning the military war, especially by the point in time when it becomes obvious to everyone except for maybe Adolf Hitler that they can't win.
Okay, understood. Okay, so if you would, Jason, take us through the day for General Eisenhower on April 12th, 1945. This is the day he visits the Ohrdruf concentration camp. Was this a planned visit for General Eisenhower, or was it something that was more kind of spur of the moment, or how did this visit of Eisenhower's to Ohrdruf come about?
It's much more spur of the moment than maybe we realize. So Eisenhower is visiting Third Army, Patton's army, along with Patton's commanding general, Omar Bradley. So it's really the big three of the American, in some respects, of the U.S. Army at that time. They're in a pretty jovial mood when the day starts. Everybody can sense that the war is not just coming to an end, but that we are on the verge of winning the war. Something that, it maybe seemed impossible or in the far distant future a few years before, in the dark days of the Battle of the Bulge in December and January 44-45, it seemed like, wait a minute, we're taking steps backwards. And now it seems like the Western Front is collapsing in front of them. The Americans can advance as far as their gas and their feet will take them. So they have a pretty nice morning. They visit a salt mine at Merkers. If you have read or seen anything about the Monuments Men, you've seen the movie. This is one of the places where the Nazis are storing art treasures, statues, paintings, gold, cash, deep underground. Some of Patton's men had stumbled onto it a few days prior, and this is what they're going to do for the day. Is they're going to go visit and see this thing. It is I like to tell this part of the story just because it shows, I think, the humorous side of all three men, because they all three laugh about it. But it's a kind of a rickety construction elevator to get from the surface down into the mine itself. And one of the three, and you read various accounts as to who said it, but says something to the effect, boy, if this cable breaks, we're going to be in big trouble, because all three of them, Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley, are in the same this little elevator car, and they laugh about it. They get down into the mine and they look around and just in astonishment at the wealth that has been looted from across Europe, and is now before them. So they come back up from the mine and they're kind of discussing sort of, what's going on for the rest of the day, what's happening. And one of Patton's aides mentions that last week our men discovered the camp and would the generals like to visit? Eisenhower says yes. And so they head to Ohrdruf. And this gets back to something we talked about earlier, because a week has passed, and within that week, other camps have been liberated, and yet this isn't sparking like, oh, wait a minute, we're seeing a pattern here, or this is literally the first camp, and it is going to be visited by the top three American generals in the European theater of operations. And so when they arrive, the camp has been under the care of the U.S. Army for about a week. Prisoners or the former prisoners are still living in the camp because no one's quite sure what they should do. It's become obvious that these people represent a multitude of ethnicities and nationalities, and we can't send them home because the war is still going on. And
right.
Do we put them into the best place is to keep them there, also because so many of them are sick, and we don't want to spread disease out. And as it's repeated in camp after camp, once medical personnel arrive, it becomes obvious that these people are malnourished, and you have to slowly get them back up into a normal caloric intake, because otherwise they will just eat and literally kill themselves by eating, because their stomachs, their digestive system are just not used to, especially high caloric foods like K rations or C rations, kinds of things. So it's decided to keep people in place. The camp has been cleaned to an extent, but not, obviously everything has been cleared up. Eisenhower arrives with this really delegation, which means there are going to be photographers. There's a camera crew that's coming with them to sort of document for back home. Here's the generals doing this sort of little tour of this portion of Germany that our boys have just taken. So it becomes, at least initially, this sort of encapsulated media frenzy. Suddenly you've got all sorts of people with cameras, and of course you've got some of the men who are there helping. They've got cameras, and oh my God, it's Ike. I'm going to take a picture and everything. So it becomes this sort of little mini spectacle in some respects. Eisenhower wants a tour, which he gets. There's a prisoner, or someone who is posing as a prisoner, steps forward to give the tour, and they go around. They see where prisoners were beaten and tortured. They see where the bodies are stacked, as Eisenhower mentions in his message to General Marshall. They visit an area where the Nazis had attempted to burn bodies in the last days, stacking dead bodies on top of railroad ties, and then setting them on fire in these gigantic funeral pyres kind of things. There are places where there are portions of bodies sticking out of dirt because they had just thrown some dirt over the bodies before leaving, or fleeing, really. He gets, at one point early on, Eisenhower asks for someone who can speak German. And his official interpreter is back at Patton's headquarters and has to catch up with them. And they find a private who steps forward and says, "Yeah, I speak German, and all right, you're going to be General Eisenhower's interpreter." And he steps up to Ike and says, "General, I have to tell you, my German's not very good." And Eisenhower says, "That's okay, mine is. I need to have this sort of filter, right? I need to be able to ask a question, listen to what he's saying, but then think about what he said and what my next question is going to be." So they make the tour of the camp. They're there for an hour and a half, and some of Eisenhower's aides begin to say, "Well, General, look, we need to get moving. It's time for us to go." And Eisenhower says, "Absolutely not. We are staying here. I have to get this." It's one of my favorite Eisenhower quotes. "I have to get this." You see that reflected in his eventual note to Marshall, in that he wanted to be able to say, "I saw this. I'm giving firsthand evidence based not on what a report said, but what I actually saw." And so they end up staying for several hours, and he literally tours just about every inch of the camp, going into buildings, walking around, talking to prisoners, viewing. One of the things that I like about the series of photos that become sort of popular, one of which is on the cover of the book, but you find them all over the internet, is there are various points in time where Eisenhower in particular has his hands on his hips. It's obvious he's in deep contemplation. There are other shots when he's walking in which he's got his hands clasped behind his back, and you can see, without having been there, but you can just sort of sense, okay, this is someone who's really trying to work out what he saw, what he's seen, and probably what did I know? What did we miss? How did we miss something like this, as well as how in God's name was this possible? Why did they do this? And I think there are probably, as with everybody, there are certain days in their lives that are incredibly impactful for them. I have no doubt in my mind that this is one of those for Reich.
Yeah, we posted on our social media a few days ago on the anniversary of on April 12th, on the anniversary, a photo of Ike exactly as you described. In this one, he's got his arms crossed, and it looks like he's talking to someone, perhaps through the interpreter. And the look on his face is just, it looks pained a little bit, but it also looks very, I would say, determined. He looks very determined. So I think that goes along with everything you're saying there. And then just, this is an aside, but I think it's interesting too, that the day Eisenhower makes this visit, April 12th, 1945, is also the same day that President Franklin Roosevelt dies. So do you have any sense of if Eisenhower and Patton and Bradley, as they're making this tour of Woodruff, have they heard this news yet? Has this even happened yet? Or when do they find out that President Roosevelt has died, and now they will now be reporting to, or the Army will be reporting to a President Harry Truman rather than a President Franklin Roosevelt?
So, because of the time difference, when they're at the camp, it either has not happened yet or has not been reported yet.
Right. Okay.
It is not until they actually make it back to Patton's headquarters. Eisenhower and Bradley are sharing a room, and they talk for several hours after, basically trying to figure out what they just saw and what they had visited. They go to bed, if I'm remembering correctly, and then get woken up in what is the middle of the night with this news. I think Patton himself comes in and says, "Hey, we just heard President Roosevelt has died." I think that's actually an important part of this story, actually, because of what happens in the next few days. Obviously, it's a shock to the nation, to the Army. When the news breaks and reaches Berlin, you've got Nazis clamping at the bit that the Western Alliance will now fall apart. Like, this is exactly as it everything's coming together for us to snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat. But for Eisenhower, for Ohrdruf, for the camps, what's interesting is Eisenhower's letter to Marshall, in which he discusses this, also includes eventually correspondence in which he asks for a congressional delegation to come and see the camp. And by this time, I think there's been sort of a shuffling within those few days,
right.
Of, hey, I want all this stuff on the camps. Like, and other units are reporting, hey, we've encountered this camp, we've encountered prisoners, we've encountered, already we're starting to use the term displaced persons. Mm-hmm. And Eisenhower reports back to Marshall, look, this is a big deal. This is like, we need more firsthand accounts. It can't just be me. It can't just be the Army. We need other people that the American people are going to trust to tell them and to show. And so you have this very interesting meeting in Marshall's office with a who's who of congressional leadership, both parties, both houses of Congress. At the same time, the country is entering this period of mourning for Franklin Roosevelt. We're trying to figure out who this Harry Truman guy is, who's suddenly president of the United States. And Marshall says that we need to put it together a delegation. And there are congressmen and senators who, they're basically fighting for spots to go.
Right. They described that in the book. I really found that telling in the book. And journalists too, I think. Didn't Eisenhower also ask for journalists to be part of this delegation as well?
Journalists, a group of editors are going to be come over. There's talk at one point as well, putting together a delegation of religious leaders to come over. The other interesting thing, or fun thing when it comes to Congress, at least, is that once news breaks of this camp that Eisenhower has visited, he's asking, yes, for an official delegation, but there are already congressmen and women, Claire Booth Luce, who will become part of the Eisenhower team later on. She's already in Europe. She's with a couple other congressmen, and they head to Eisenhower's headquarters like, hey, we want to go see these camps too. There's a delegation from Parliament that comes because Eisenhower also requests that from Winston Churchill. And so suddenly you've got all these official tours that are going on, and it becomes almost, I mean, it has a momentum of its own in that once one group leaves, there's this other group that seemingly decides, hey, we need to be there too, or we want to be able to report back to our constituents. And eventually, this is before the end of the war, but it's, within several weeks, Eisenhower said, we don't need to send any more delegations. Like, don't just people like they can come on their own, but I'm done organizing these things. There are other things
probably getting in the way at this point, right?
Yeah, because everybody also wants to talk to him so that they've got the photo op as well, right? So
okay, yeah, that's I like the context there of, wow, this all happening on the same day. Man, to be a fly on the wall in the room that Eisenhower and Bradley, West Point classmates, in fact, are sharing together and talking that night after this visit to Ohrdruf it's mind-boggling to think. So you mentioned earlier that the prisoners who were physically able had been put on this death march out of Ohrdruf to go to Dachau. So were there any German guards, the commandant, anybody that had been at Ohrdruf? Were any of those folks still there on the day that Eisenhower visits? Does he see or meet any of them? And do any of them ever face justice for their role in the Holocaust?
There are no Germans. The guy who gives the tour, who's the prisoner who gives the Eisenhower the tour, it's believed was probably himself a prisoner, but had served as in sort of a the Nazis they utilized prisoners to keep prisoners in line, the sort of capos and others. He is within about a day or two of their visit. Patton is going to write Eisenhower within a couple of days and say, hey, by the way, the guy who took us on the tour, he was killed after we left by other prisoners because he was apparently he worked for the Germans. He goes, I don't know. And they have some discussion back and forth about, well, he did seem to be in better shape. So apparently he tried to hide in plain sight a little bit and maybe hoped that nobody remembered or recognized him because maybe the people he worked with had already been shipped off. In terms of Germans facing a reckoning from just Ohrdruf, I'm going to say not really. Okay. There's no Ohrdruf. Let's put it this way: there's no Ohrdruf trial in that sense. Like there will be a Dachau trial or a Flossenburg trial. This is a subcamp. It's a relatively small camp. Now, that's not to say that maybe some of the people who definitely could have worked at Ohrdruf aren't found for their crimes and treated to some justice as part of the Dachau trials. But there's no specific, we need to do a trial because Eisenhower visited this camp.